Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Las Vegas GP race. Wow, what a race. I was not expecting that in the least. I was expecting more of a boring, some other kind of race, not a passing race that would kind of had everything going on at the same time. I mean, I know there was lots of passes with the DRS, and so I know that's not, some people's thought of like a true racing circuit where they have that benefit of the DRS to help them get by in those straights. But I think we had some decent passes along the corners and through the braking zones as well, so that gave us this kind of dynamic race. We actually had a little bit of a, pit strategy involved that kind of didn't play out quite as well as we had liked to some degree because of the safety car that came out. But in general, I think it was a fairly good race, fairly good strategy involved in different positions to give this a real good feel for this race. So what was your thoughts on this race? Did you like it? I generally don't like all the big hubbub and fluff and all the celebrities getting all their spotlights, because I'm like, this is about the race. This is not about the venue or the people that are coming to it. I think it should be focused on the drivers, focused on the how they're going to perform, how the teams are going to perform. Are the teams prepared for this circuit? The temperatures. I know this is a new circuit, so that made a lot of ifs. So we'll have to see next year to see if that actually plays out a little bit more, and having all that data that they've gathered this year through this race to see if they can get closer or if it'll just make things more of a mess. I don't know. We'll have to find out. But again, what was your thoughts on this race? Did you like this race? Did you like the hype? Did you like the all the fancy lights and the introductions and all of the fun other things that were going wrong outside of the race? For me, as I said, just the race is what I like to focus on. Anyway, so I will usually go through the drivers from the last to the first and give you my thoughts on those. So without further ado, we will start off with Lando Norris, who ended up crashing out fairly early in this race on lap 3, causing the first virtual safety car. As far as I can tell, it looked like what they were saying on the announcers, that he was just having that full load going down that track, hit a couple of bumps that brought up the rear tire, so he didn't have that grip that he needed. So when he hit that corner, there was nothing there so he could basically end up started spinning when he started trying to turn a little bit into that, and had a pretty big incident into the barrier. I think they said he was going to be okay. They were just doing some standard checks to confirm that at the medical stations there. So hopefully he's okay and everything works out for him. I know it's a very disappointing weekend for Lando Norris. I couldn't really judge him a whole lot. I know that McLaren was not set up real well for this race, even though we saw his teammate do a lot better than I was kind of expecting him to do in this race, where they qualified and how they were looking in the free practice sessions. But I know he would have done everything he could have, and so I would have liked to seen him kind of figure out where he could have played out in this race with everything else going on. But so it's a shame for him to go out. I can't really blame him for that incident, as I think it was more of a car setup with not knowing exactly where those bumps were. So probably a little bit too low in that setting. Then you have Nico Hülkenberg, who ended up having an engine issue, if I'm not mistaken, on lap 47. So he made it almost to the end of the race before having to drop out himself. He did gain 2 positions at the start of the race and was just not quite there on those tires. In those, that engine was probably giving way a little bit, so he's dropping back a little bit farther into the field. Not a great position coming in from that 13th spot, but he was up in that general area of during this race, so he's kind of like battling it out with those folks around him. Generally, I think the Haas's kind of fell back a little bit farther than they probably were expecting to. Those tires just, they wear those tires out way too quick, I think, is the big general gist of it. And so they have to wear through those graining periods, which then pushes them farther back before the cars around them, before they can gain a little bit back. And by that point, it's kind of hard to really regain those positions. So still not the race that Nico Hülkenberg would have liked, but not really a fault of his own for being able to retire that vehicle. So good on him for that, in the sense that, he kept his chin up during this race, even though it was kind of a rough race for him. And then we have Yuki, who made it almost, what did he say, to the very last lap. He actually ended up having a issue with his gearbox, I believe, and then having to pull out for 49 or 50, if I believe that's correct, which gave us light yellow flag for him pulling off right behind where Hülkenberg had pulled off. But it didn't really affect the race in that regard. So a disappointing weekend for Yuki. He started at the back of the pack, didn't have a good qualifying at all in that 20th position. Did gain a couple of positions. Actually, he gained quite a few positions on the very start of the race. I have it here that he gained 8 positions, which I was kind of shocked at, of how we had several people that had really good or really bad starts, it seems, in this race, but nothing that was, too drastic, even though they had a couple of weird contact points at the beginning of this race. But it didn't explain to me how Yuki could have jumped up 8 positions, and I didn't see any replays for that. So that's a really good start for him, getting up into those, 8 positions off the start of the race. So I'm sure he was not at all happy about having a gearbox issue near the end of the race, even though he wasn't probably in that or near those point positions. I think he was still at the back of that field, but still, at that point, it's always hard to just retire the vehicle. You kind of want to finish the race just out of spite in that sense. Valtteri Bottas didn't have a good race either. He started off in 7th and ended up in 17th. He kind of got tied up at the very beginning of the race with Alonso, actually, sliding across the track and then spinning around, and then Valtteri didn't have any spot to go to, so he ended up he kind of ran into him, messing up his front wing, and so he was having to actually pit fairly early in this race to mess around with that front wing to try to get it fixed. And so he was one of those few people that dropped 13 positions at the start of the race because of that contact with Alonso that almost took out Albon as well, but really would kind of just stuck Bottas in the wrong strategy, wrong position, and where he couldn't go anywhere at all. And then we had Logan Sargent, who's had a disappointing weekend for the race part. He had a great day yesterday or this morning in the qualifying session, depending on where you were in the world. Starting off in 6th position, probably one of the highest starts that Logan had started this year, and ended up in 16th. So he dropped quite a few positions. They said that they were just not quite the right tire strategy, and that safety car came out just at the wrong time, which pushed them kind of in the wrong spot for whichever strategy they went for. If they pitted, then it would have kind of left them back, but if they stayed out, which is what they did, it kind of hurt them in the long run because of they were in those used tires while everybody else had the fresher sets around them, trying to get those tires back into play. So he did pit. His first pit stop was on lap 15, switching from mediums to hards, and then just had kind of this long stint. Not the race Williams wanted, but of course, luckily for them, any of their competitors that they were really fighting for in the constructor standings. Didn't get any points either, so that is a plus. And I think they said that they were really fighting more with the AlphaTauris, Alfa Romeos, and Haas's. So in general, they kind of were ahead of them at the end of the race, even though they weren't having any points as well. So that is always a good position for it to be in to help motivate them for this last race that they have in Abu Dhabi, to see if they can really tweak out what they need for that Williams car. Juan Zhou started the race in 17th and ended up in 15th. I don't have a whole lot for him. He did okay start, not gaining or losing any positions. One of the few people that were kind of in those standard positions, kind of worked his way up to 15th. Started off on hards and just so as a slightly alternate strategy from the rest of the field. Was able to, I'm not sure if it would make that strategy work. I think Valtteri would have done better than Juan Zhou, except for the fact that he got caught up in that contact in that first start, which caused him to drop back into the field. So I think he was just trying that alternate strategy since he wasn't having the qualifying sessions and the practice sessions for that Alfa Romeo they looked like. But I think he did a decent job. Always good to be ahead of your teammate at the end of the race in whatever circumstances that causes in that position. So good on Juan Zhou for that. Daniel Ricciardo started off in 14th and ended up in 14th. I have hardly anything for him. I didn't see him a whole lot in this race with all these weird passes. It's kind of surprising me. I probably have to go back and rewatch this race to catch all of the passes and figure out what was going on throughout the field. But he started off in 14th, as I said. Did lose 2 spots at the very beginning of the race, but was able to regain those in that circuit through his strategy. He did start off like with the normal people on the medium tires and then switched over to the hards. Did a decent job, but at AlphaTauri was kind of lacking in this cold weather with this circuit. I don't know what it was. I think they were hoping that they would have a better position due to the long straights, but I guess those corners or something didn't agree with them too much, and so they couldn't really get the most out of that AlphaTauri. So we'll have to see where they end up in the race in Abu Dhabi, see if they can gain any ground potentially. Kevin Magnussen actually had a decent race, even though it doesn't look quite like that. He started off in 8th and ended up in 13th. He did gain 1 position at the beginning of the race. He did pass Oscar Piastri on lap 10 for 8th, and then he had a good fight with Juan Zhou, and then he passed Juan Zhou on lap 47 for 13th position. He did start off on mediums and then switched to hards, then had another stint on the hards. Just not quite where that Haas needs to be overall. They were doing that double strategy where Kevin was on the new spec on that Haas and Hulkenberg was on the old spec, I believe. So hopefully they can get some information from those 2 different drivers. Hopefully their driving style is enough the same that they can really dig into it and figure out what they need to maximize in that design for next year's car to really get the most out of that aero package they have on that Haas. But again, it looks like bad because he dropped down a few positions from the 8th to the 13th, kind of out of the points. But he didn't have that bad of a race from what I saw. He was having some pretty good battles, going back and forth with some people, just not quite the speed that they needed. And, of course, wearing those tires out a little faster than the rest of the field kind of hurt them in this race. Then you have Alex Albon, who started off in 5th, ended up on 12th. We kind of already talked a little bit about how Williams kind of just had the wrong strategy for when the safety car came out. They were saying that if they were like a few cars ahead in the battle that would have done a lot better because of that safety car, but because where they were standing when that safety car came out, they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because they couldn't really take advantage of it where other people could. And that's kind of the roll of the dice for some of these things. It's a shame because they were looking really good, getting up there in that, the top 5 or 6 positions for the qualifying session, which kind of surprised a lot of people, having good straightaway speeds. I know the wind was picking up as well in this race and switching, so that could have affected the Williams as well. Which is kind of known to be sensitive to the wind, changes in the directions and stuff on that Williams. So that could have been part of it as well. It's just hard to really dive into that and figure out why they weren't able to hold those positions as easily as they were able to take them in the qualifying session. It's probably more the race pace versus qualifying laps, but not quite where Williams was hoping to be in this race. I think Alex did a really good job of trying to keep his Williams up there, but in the end, those tires, were just in the wrong strategy. Having those worn older tires around him, where the newer tire people like, Pierre Gasly's them were able to make their way around him in the end. So that's more on the team, more on the setup, I guess, but possibly more than the driver. I think Albon did an excellent job. Was fighting near the top of the field for most of this race, so I liked what I saw from him. Pierre Gasly was kind of a weird mix here. He actually started in 4th and ended up in 11th. He started off on medium tires, and those medium tires seemed to be really good on that Alpine. Getting up there, staying up there in the first, top positions, that 4th, that 5th, staying up in that realm fairly well. But then when he pitted for those hards, it seemed something didn't quite agree with that Alpine on his vehicle, because after he pitted, he was not able to make up that ground and kind of started losing positions at that point, but for the people around him, and so he kind of dropped back. So I'm sure it was a frustrating race for him in that regard. They were calling it basically the strategy he was on was the wrong strategy from what I heard in the interview process. So I took that as more of the setup for the Alpine and the hard tires, but it could be more just the flat out strategy didn't quite work as well due to the safety cars as well as they would have liked it to. So that pushed him just outside the point range into that 11th position. So I said the beginning of that race was really good, kind of fell off near that second half when he switched tires. So if that was a tire issue or if that was something else going on, I was taking it more of that his vehicle not liking those hard tires in this cold weather. So that leaves us to the top 10 with Oscar Piastri, which actually got the fastest lap. Did a really good job, I think, starting off in the 18th position, worked his way up to 10th, getting those points, which was really nice to see McLaren getting points after having a struggling in the free practice sessions and in the qualifying session, dropping out in that, Q3 before everybody else could get up to, actually it was So that first qualifying session, they weren't able to make it and just really struggled this whole weekend. And able to piece together, really fighting it up. He started off in the hards, which was a complete different strategy than the rest of the field for most in general. Went long and was able to keep those tires from like 44, I think, to switch over to the medium tires because he did a hard medium, and then hoping for another, safety car or virtual safety car near the end of the race where they could have really taken advantage of that strategy, but it didn't play out. So he kind of dropped back into that, just outside the points, and worked his way back into the points near the end of this race. As I said, got the fastest lap, which is, good to see. He got that extra point, which helps him out, even though it's not drastic at this point. He did have a good fights around him in this battle, passing Yuki at the restart of the race for 11th, passing K-Mag on lap 10 for the 8th position. And then he had Gasly on lap 25 for 3rd at the restart, and then kind of dropping back in when he repitted for that last set. He did end up having contact and having a puncture as well, is what I have here. So that kind of hurt him in that stint, but was able to make it work for the most part for him. So a really good race for Oscar Piastri, in my view. Did a really good job and got the most out of that McLaren that he could in this run. I know that's not where the McLaren really wanted to be. They were looking to be, up there with those Ferraris, potentially, with the Red Bulls, but more Ferraris and Mercedes range. So in all of that, it was a really good run for him. Fernando Alonso started off in 9th and ended up in 9th. He did lose 10 spots at the very beginning of the race with that spin, almost hitting Albon in that process, and then basically having contact with Bottas as he spun around, and Bottas had nowhere to go and kind of bumped into him on the side of the track. But then he was kind of able to work his way back up into the field, getting back up into that 9th position. So kind of had to get that front wing replaced early on, like on lap 2, due to that contact. So with all of that said, it's really good to see him back up in the 9th. I know he's probably frustrated in that incident at the very beginning of the race. I kind of see that as his own fault because he went on the inside, probably a little bit more dusty, a little bit more cool, and then just kind of didn't hit the braking zone, kind of went long, and then basically the rear kind of let go as he was trying to make that corner, and just spun in that corner, not taking didn't take as many people as I would have thought he would have doing that maneuver. So that was kind of on him in my view. But be able to come back after that and get back to that 9th position and get some points is always good to see. So a decent race, even though he had a pretty bad mistake at the very beginning, in my view, of this race. So good on Alonso for not giving up and be able to get back into the points. Then we have George Russell, who started off in 3rd and ended up in 8th. He kind of had an up and down race. He started off fairly decently, but kind of ended up having some contact and some other issues that caused him to drop back into the field a little bit farther than he probably deserved through just performance-wise. I have him passing Juan Yujo on lap 20 for 7th, and then passing Alonso for lap 23 for 5th. Passing Sainz on lap 25 for 4th, and then passing Stroll on lap 49 for 5th. He did have a 5-second penalty for causing the collision with Max Verstappen as they were coming around. He basically turned into Max Verstappen right before the long straightaway, which I think he just wasn't ready for, and so he wasn't looking out like he should have been for people coming up to him. That caused some contact that kind of messed up his floor and messed up Max Verstappen's front wing a little bit. It sounded like from that contact. So it messed up George more than it did for Max in that damage quality to try to make out that difference. So he went the distance and did a fairly good push at the end, but of course with that 5-second penalty was able to didn't really have an advantage on that. So it kind of pushed him back into that 8th position overall. He would have finished up a little higher than the field if it wasn't for that contact penalty. So probably not the best move for not quite catching and being ready for Max as he was coming through the field in that regard. But due to the circumstances, I think he did a fairly good job of, maintaining where he was after that contact and that damage to minimize the damage that caused. So a decent run, even though he had a mistake in his running. Lewis Hamilton started off in 10th and ended up in 7th. I have him losing 4 spots at the very beginning of the race, so he had a pretty bad start. Then he had to work his way back up through the field, in this stint. I know he had passed Hulkenberg on lap 11 for 10th, so that kind of gives you an idea of where that running was, kind of in that back of that pack where you're not used to running with those other liveries and other teams in that rear guard and coming back up through the ranks, back up to that 7th position. So a really good race for him, getting the most out of that Mercedes, where he started off, where he ended up with some issues that he had at the start of the race and some other things that were kind of going on with that Mercedes this weekend. It wasn't quite where they wanted it to be, as you saw from the qualifying sessions, not quite gelling with that Mercedes this weekend. Was getting those settings correct. George had a better time with that, so Lewis was kind of dragging behind, but was able to make the most out of that Mercedes during the race. Carlos Sainz did a pretty good race, even though he had that 10 spot grid penalty for having replacement engine parts. It's dropping him back to that starting grid of 12th. He ended up was going to be a 2nd position on the grid if it wasn't for those positions. And that was caused by that drain lid coming off that it shouldn't have. And there's, of course, all the discussion on that. And I definitely agree with all of that discussion that Carlos shouldn't have probably been penalized for something that was like a safety concern on the track itself that was an issue. It wasn't caused by him or any other teams around him in that regard. But I also can see, the fact that, we don't want necessarily brand new parts coming in, that would help him because they could crank up those engine parts, with a couple of races left that would not give the same advantage to everybody else. So there's some give and take there. I think that definitely probably, 10 place grid penalty was a little harsh in that regard, because it wasn't his fault at all, and it wasn't the team's fault at all in that spot for their strategy. But he was able to make up 6 positions out of that and get up to 6th spot. I know he was struggling with some heat at the very beginning of the race, trying to really push and pass some vehicles, and so they were actually trying to get him to get into that, fresh air to cool down some of the engine and some other issues that he was experiencing following cars too closely at the beginning of the race. But was able to get that stint, cool down the vehicles, and then work his way still back up into that 6th position. So I think he did an excellent job in this running, even though he kind of lost some positions at the very beginning of the race, that start, having some contact with Lewis at the beginning, and then, but kind of working his way back up was always good to see him, getting those passes done, kind of pushing it to the limit, kind of like we saw Max do after that second pit stop, kind of getting back in the field and seeing what those Ferraris and those Red Bulls can actually do when they're in the field with everybody else. So good to see that in regards He did a really good job. I think he got the most out of that Ferrari that he could. So it's not quite like the Red Bulls, I don't think, in that stint. Comparatively, the Ferrari and the Red Bulls, I think the Red Bulls still have the advantage over the Ferraris, as we saw. But he did do a really good job of coming back from that penalty that he received for not his fault, as I said, to get up to that 6th position. And then we have Lance Stroll, which I think did an awesome job. I can't believe I didn't see more of him during this race because, starting off in that 9th position and working your way all the way back up to that 5th position is unbelievable. I see that he, supposedly got a 10-place position increase. He gained 10 positions on the very start of the race, so that first lap he was up to that 9th position, which is phenomenal, which I didn't quite catch on any of the feeds that I saw. So I would like to go see how he did that, how that worked out for him, and then be able to maintain those positions and work his way all the way up to that 5th position. He got absolutely everything that he could out of that Aston Martin and was able to do, the maximum he could possibly do. So excellent job for Lance Stroll, especially with all the crap that a lot of people give him for just being in that vehicle due to his dad. Kind of shows some of that. He kind of deserves to be there at least part of the time, if it's not all of the time, in this season for Formula One. So we get Esteban Ocon, who did have another good race, starting off in 16th and ended up in 4th. He was just on the right strategy, I believe, be able to make it in time for getting those positions and just working his way back up through the fields. He was another, high gainer on that first lap, gaining 8 positions on the start of the race, and then was able to maintain that and work his way up slowly from that point onwards. Passing K-Mag on lap 7 for 10th, Logan on lap 14 for 6th, and Gasly on lap 34 for 5th. Kind of working his way all the way up to that front line. Saw some really good passes from him in this race, really fighting it out. Really good to see Ocon doing all he could. And then we also saw that, pass on his teammate around that same time when that radio message was saying, stay in line behind him. So there was kind of some miscommunication there. I think from what I heard, he just heard, position, and he had made the move around his teammate, and so he was ready to give that position back, but they never did really say to give it back, so he just pushed on forward, which helped out in general because he had the better strategy for that Alpine in this race due to things and getting really good points for that Alpine in this race. So he did a really good job in my view. Especially where he ended up not quite in that qualifying position. So I think that was partly getting blocked during the qualifying. He didn't get that clean run, so he ended up starting farther back than he should have. And then that kind of shown in this race where he was able to work his way back into really good points. And Sergio Perez started off in 11th and ended up in 3rd. He had a really good race, I thought, too. And I have this hard time saying that in the sense that because a lot of times he's kind of ended up in the back and just kind of had slowly worked his way, but didn't really get to be able to put that pressure on the front runners a lot of times when he has a bad qualifying session. But this one was completely different as he worked his way back up. He only gained 1 spot at the very beginning of the race, but was able to work his way through in this race. Passing Hulkenberg on lap 13th for 17th position, passed, several different folks, worked his way back up, took the lead of the race from Leclerc on lap 32, and then kind of got pushed back again, and then passed Leclerc again on lap 43 for second position. And of course, at the end of the race, Leclerc was able to gain that DRS just enough to push him back into that second position at that very last lap. So I think Sergio Perez did a really good job. I know he didn't quite have the touch that Max has in that Red Bull, but I think he got, was doing a really good job being that second position. Even though he didn't end up in second in this race, he was very close, and I think he did, for the most part, what he needed to, and probably helped out his teammate in that fight with Charles Leclerc, while Max was coming back through the field, kind of slowing them up a little bit, wearing those tires out for Charles a little bit more than he might not have had in the past. So I think Perez did a really good job in this race. Still getting third, was not quite where he wanted to be, where he had taken over that second position, but I think he could lift his head high in this race, knowing that he basically gave pretty much all he could in this race, even the fight to the very end, just missing it out slightly. So good on Sergio Perez in this race, gaining good points. And then, of course, that locked him out because of Lewis Hamilton being in seventh. That locks out that second position in the driver standings. So that's good for him as well, and which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then, of course, we have Charles Leclerc, who started off in first, ended up in second. I know he had the debate at the very beginning of the race because he didn't have the greatest start, but was able to start putting pressure on Max going into that first corner, which pushed Max a little hard and was sliding out, which pushed Charles Leclerc out as well on that first corner, and then losing that first position. But then that gained that 5-second penalty for Max, which I thought at that point was not that bad of a deal, because I figured Max, since he was in the lead, he'd basically gain that 5 seconds fairly easily, but that was not the case. He was able to keep up with Max in that first stint, keeping a really good gap between him and Max, and then forcing Max basically to pit first. So he pitted first, and so I was thinking, Charles was going to extend it. It looked like he was doing a really good job, and I think that safety car really hurt Charles in the sense that Max was able to pit again for another set of tires and still be behind, but not be that far behind of a two-stop stint opposed to his Charles Leclerc's first, one stop going through this race. So I think that really helped Max out in this race. But it was really good to see him actually fight and take the lead from Max during race pace, force Max to actually do a earlier pit stop than what Charles Leclerc was planning on, and then seeing if that pit strategy was going to actually go into effect and help out maintain that first position, which it looked like it was going to do, except for that safety car that later came out, which put him at a slightly disadvantage with older tires. And of course, that Ferrari was not looking as well on the harder tires as the medium tires stint that he was on, which was the opposite of what Red Bull was on with Max, where the harder tires seemed to be better on that Red Bull than the medium tires. So we had the kind of the flip flop of who was good and who was bad on what tire set, which helped out a little bit more on Max's stint in the sense that that hard tire could go a little bit longer, which kind of hurt Charles Leclerc's position to be able to maintain that first position or fight back to that first position. We did see that come back after he took over that first position from Charles Leclerc. looked like he was going to maintain at least that DRS time period, but Max was able to actually pull out just what he needed to get ahead of him. And then, of course, on the radio, we heard him tell the radio team told Max, like, "Okay, you drop back a little bit to hopefully help out Sergio Perez with that, drag, but without putting Max in the danger zone." So that didn't quite work out for Red Bull, but it was still a good fight for those top three positions all the way around in this race, which is good to see since we haven't seen that a whole lot during this season. Usually the first runner has a nice gap, and then you have the second or third runners kind of fighting it out. So it's kind of good to see that gap being within fighting range for most of the race, if not all of the race. So good on Max, good on Charles. Even though Max had that 5-second penalty for running off the track, he was able to work with that safety car to minimize that to the minimum, to the best he could, and it was easily got into that first position due to the positions where Charles Leclerc was coming out on those older tires with Max on the newer tires. Just gain that ground and end up in first. So Max again, the winner of the race. Not hard to see. You were expecting that from the get-go. You just weren't expecting it to be this close. So that kind of gave that little more oomph in this race. I think that made it a lot more interesting, a lot more dynamic for the TV audience to see that first position being under attack more than we've seen this season in general. So that gave that extra excitement in this race. So, as I said, I thought this was a fairly good race. Had a lot of stuff going on, a lot of passes, hard to keep up with, hard to figure out why things happened. So I'll have to go back and again look at some of the race highlights and some other aspects of this to get the better feel of this. But this is my initial reactions after seeing the Las Vegas GP. This leads us to the driver standings. Of course, Max won it, now has 549 points, but won it in Qatar. Sergio Perez clinches that second position, and Lewis Hamilton, I think, clinches the third position. So those top three positions are locked. We basically have that fight for fourth between Carlos Sainz and Alonso, and possibly Lando Norris in that mix as well, with Charles Leclerc not too far away. But you saw Charles jumping ahead of Alonso into that fourth position, pushing back Alonso to the fifth and Lando to sixth in this driver standings this weekend. The rest of the field basically stays the same, a little bit of points gained here and there. Of course, the backpack of this, pretty much from 13th on, basically remain the same without any changes to points. And the constructors standings stay the same. We see Red Bull having a whopping 822 points over Mercedes 392 points. Of course, Ferrari, and that's that battle they were talking about in the interview processes with 388. So they're still in striking range of taking that second position over from Mercedes in that last race. Of course, some odd things are probably going to have to happen in that last race for that to happen, but it's still in that mix for the hopes to see if we can get the most out of that Ferrari to reclaim that second position. And then you have McLaren, good steady with 284 in that fourth, with Aston Martin with 273. So there's a slightly mix there that could happen as well. And then the rest of the field drops back down. And of course, Williams wants to make sure that they stay in that seventh position overall. And that was why they were kind of disappointed this race, having qualified so well and not gaining any points. But they were hopeful in the sense that they were still ahead of their competitors with AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, and Haas in that running where they didn't get any points either. So they're still steadily in that 7th position. So what is coming up next, of course, is Abu Dhabi. On November 26th is when the race is, the Yas Marina circuit. That length is 3.281 miles. It's going to have 58 laps run for a total distance of 190.253 miles. Max Verstappen has the lap record in 2021 of 1 minute 26.103 seconds. And it was first introduced in 2009. And this is the last last race of the season. So we'll finalize everything after this and see how things line up for this final race. Until then, we'll see you on the grid. And of course, if you made it this far, I would appreciate a like. And if you want to see my reactions for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, you can subscribe and hit that notification bell. And hopefully you'll get notified when my reaction comes out. So thank you very much. And until the Abu Dhabi race, I will see you later.